Hi, everyone. I'm Rajiv Khanna from Thousand Currents. Thank you for that. We've made it to the last session of the day, y'all. You can get up, do a little stretch, we are at that time, the witching hour of the day, right? But hopefully the discussion is riveting and invigorating enough to wake you up. I belong to an organization called Thousand Currents. Rohit, thanks for giving us a shout out. We are a US-based public foundation. We raise resources and re-grant them to community groups and social movements around the world, working on climate, food, and economic justice. We also have a robust donor education program where we try to influence donors to shift philanthropic practices so that they are more movement and community aligned. You heard from Vrinda about the scale of the climate crisis that is confronting India, which is one of the most vulnerable regions and countries in the world. The scales we are talking about are absolutely unimaginable right now. The climate crisis affects agriculture, fisheries, livestock. We're talking about at least 2/3 of the Indian workforce. We're talking about 900 million to 1 billion people whose livelihoods would be directly impacted by the climate crisis, not to mention the overwhelming amount of climate migration that the subcontinent is going to experience. And you've already seen a taste of that, right? With the incredible floods that happened in Pakistan recently, where at least 1/3 of the entire country was displaced, right? And we're still counting what the impact of that was. Given that this is such a massive crisis, it's going to need all of us to solve it, right? And at this point, who we've eliminated or marginalized from the conversation on climate solutions are communities themselves who are on the front lines and experiencing the most direct impacts of the climate crisis. We know communities who experience injustice are critical to overcoming it, and they often have the best solutions. So at this moment, the question before us is whose leadership do we wish to follow? Whose visions, dreams, and practices do we wish to follow? And whose solutions, right, does philanthropy want to resource? Traditionally, philanthropy has looked at just a couple of levers of change in society, markets and governments, and we've invisibilized and completely left out of the discourse people-powered social movements. The metrics of history are on our side. Our country gained independence because of a social movement, right? Women's rights, labor rights, environmental rights movements are powered by people-powered social movements. Social movements in the United States, like the Black Lives Matter movement, are the result why we're having these conversations here today. Why organizations like Dasra and others are even considering adopting or moving towards a JEDI framework. Where are these coming from? Social movements have the power to shift political will, to shift public discourse and public will, and completely reshape the public conversation. Yet, philanthropy has left out climate justice movements from the solution. And we know we're going to need climate justice movements if we're going to make any dent on addressing this climate crisis. Just to give you an indication of where the money in climate philanthropy is going, a few years ago, ClimateWorks Foundation released a landmark report on climate giving. They found out that only 2%, just 2% of all global philanthropic giving is going towards climate. Wow. You want an example of how out of touch philanthropy is with current crises? Look at that stat. Out of the 2% that's going towards climate philanthropy, less than 1% is going towards indigenous or Adivasi people. Indigenous people comprising 5% of the world's population are stewarding 80% of the world's global biodiversity, yet receive crumbs of crumbs, right? 1% of the 2%. Less than 1% is going towards women. Women, especially in India, we know play an absolutely crucial role when it comes to running the rural economy. 75% of women, rural women in India are involved in agriculture, right? But they own less than 14% of land or control less than 14% of land. When we look at the stats of Dalit women and Adivasi women, that's even more abysmal. Just 1.5% of Dalit women have access to land. Less than 1% of indigenous or Adivasi women in India have access to land. But they are the ones who are running the agricultural economy in India. And they've been completely left out and marginalized out of the solutions. So, Today, in this conversation, we want to talk about how can we bring communities back into the climate conversation? How can philanthropy put communities at the center of funding and at the center of solutions and at the center of shifting power, right, to the communities? And I'm joined today by Deepa of Anubhuti Trust, Rikin, and Shruti, who are all going to speak about this issue from their vantage points. I want to begin with Deepa and ask her, Deepa, ground us in you are experiencing the direct impacts of the climate crisis. What is your experience and what are you seeing on the ground?
Big task, Shreya. Hopefully सब जिंदा है. Great. जिंदा रहने वाला हमारा सेशन है. हम क्लाइमेट चेंज के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं. मुझे लग रहा है कि सबसे पहले फिलॉन्थ्रोपिस्ट हो या कोई भी कंट्रीब्यूटर हो, जब क्लाइमेट चेंज को लेकर खास तौर पे हम बात कर रहे हैं, बहुत ज़्यादा सीखने के गट्स शायद हमें रखने होंगे, बहुत ही ज़्यादा. क्योंकि सदियों से काफ़ी सालों से आदिवासी, एनटीडीएनटी, दलित, ये जो ग्राउंड में बसने वाले लोग हैं और इनका जो एनवायरनमेंट के साथ कनेक्शन है, इस नॉलेज को हमने बैकवर्ड बोल के बहुत प्रॉब्लम किया है. इसको हमने सुपरस्टिशियस बोल के बहुत प्रॉब्लम किया है. ये जो नॉलेज है वो बस एनवायरमेंटल H2O कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड तक लिमिटेड नहीं है, राइट. उनका जो नॉलेज है, हमारे जो प्रैक्टिसेस है, जब आप हमारी कम्युनिटीज़ में आओगे तब आप देखोगे कि एनवायरनमेंट बस ट्राइबल कम्युनिटी के लिए रिसोर्सेस नहीं है, बस रिसोर्स कंजप्शन का मार्ग नहीं है. तो वो उनके लिए उनका आर्ट है, उनके लिए उनके लैंग्वेज है, उनके लिए उनके बिलीफ सिस्टम है, उनके रिचुअल्स है, और उनकी सारी चीज़ें जो है, उनका एग्जिस्टेंस जो है, वो एनवायरनमेंट जस्टिस के साथ जुड़ा हुआ है. तो इन शॉर्ट अगर मैं कहूँ तो ये कम्युनिटी का जस्टिस इसीलिए नहीं सामने आ पा रहा है क्योंकि एनवायरमेंटल के साथ बहुत ज़्यादा इनजस्टिस हो रहा है.
When talking about climate change or talking about climate action, these conversations can only happen when we have a learning mindset and a learning outlook. It's very important to have an open mindset because for a very long time, the knowledge and the connection that Adivasi and nomadic tribes or tribal communities have had with the environment has been called backward and superstitious. What we need to realize is for these communities, environment is not just a resource, but it's also their art, their language, their belief system, their rituals, and their existence. When we talk about climate injustice, it's not just injustice that therefore happens with climate, but with these communities at large.
इम्पैक्ट अगर मैं राजीव कहूँ तो जीने मरने के सवाल है यहाँ पे, राइट. दीप जो सुबह बात कर रहा था, फ्लड का इम्पैक्ट हो, ड्रॉट पड़ने से जो गांव की गांव माइग्रेंट कर जाते हैं. माइग्रेशन बस ये आंखों को दिखने वाला सफ़र नहीं है कि एक गांव दूसरी जगह से तीसरी जगह पे गया है, राइट. ये उनकी स्टेबिलिटी का विषय है, उनकी सोशल सिक्योरिटी का विषय है, उनके एग्जिस्टेंस का ये बार बार सवाल है हर इंटरसेक्शनलिटी में. क्या वो एग्जिस्ट करेंगे स्कूल के अंदर, क्या वो एग्जिस्ट करेंगे लाइवलीहुड के अंदर, उनके रिचुअल्स, उनके कल्चर लॉस जैसा बहुत बड़ा लॉस कोई नहीं है. क्योंकि ये कम्युनिटी के कल्चर जो है वो इतने एनवायरमेंटल फ्रेंडली और एनवायरमेंट बेस्ड है, लेकिन अचानक जो ये उथल पुथल हो रही है, और ये उथल पुथल थोड़े से पावर रखने वाले लोगों को देर में दिखाई दे रही है, ट्राइबल्स को पहले ही दिखाई दे रही है. उनके स्टोरीज में, हमारे गानों में, हमारी भाषाओं में, हमारे नरेटिव्स में बार बार एनवायरनमेंट का सम्मान है, लेकिन वो सम्मान जो है वो मेन स्ट्रीमिंग कम्युनिटी की मुख्य धारा का मुख्य भाग नहीं बन पाया है.
If we start to talk about the impact that climate change has on communities like tribal and Adivasi communities, it's safe to say that it's a question of life and death. Deep was talking this morning about areas and communities impacted by flood and drought, how it causes migration. It's also important to look and understand that migration is more than just moving from one place to another. It affects stability, social security, and most importantly, it causes loss of culture. Communities that live in areas that are impacted by climate are heavily dependent on their surroundings, and therefore environment losses caused by migration and climate change impact them heavily. tribals see the danger that we pose to climate and the impact that climate sees today much before anyone else does, and yet they are the ones who are impacted most heavily because of climate change.
लास्ट में इसका जवाब दे के फिर रुक जाती हूँ कि अगर आपको कोई अभी बोले कि आपको आपके जॉब को रिज़ाइन देना है, आप 10 बार सोचोगे, प्लान करोगे और फिर दोगे। एक्सट्रीम जो ऑक्यूपेशन क्राइसिस हो रहे हैं उसके बारे में हम कैसे देखेंगे जो लाखों करोड़ों में हो रहे हैं। कई ऐसे कम्युनिटीज़ है जिनका ऑक्यूपेशन, जिनका एम्प्लॉयमेंट एनवायरमेंटल साइकिल के ऊपर डिपेंड है, सीज़न के ऊपर डिपेंड है। उनके मैप, उनके रूट ऑफ माइग्रेशन ये एनवायरनमेंट के इर्द गिर्द होते हैं। एनवायरनमेंट जब भी डिस्टर्ब हो रहा है, वो जवाब मांग रहा है, वो अकाउंटेबिलिटी मांग रहा है, तो सबसे पहले वो उसी से अकाउंटेबिलिटी मांग रहा है जो उसके ऊपर डिपेंड है, जो उसके साथ जुड़े हुए हैं, जिनकी नींव एनवायरनमेंट के साथ है, राइट। तो ये बहुत ही बड़ा एक पैनिक भी है जो सेटल्ड है, जो इमोशनल मेंटल हेल्थ के ऊपर असर कर रहा है। इंटरनल कम्युनिटी एक ट्रॉमा क्रिएट कर रहा है। उनको समझ में भी नहीं आ रहा है कि ये सारी चीज़ें अपने आप जो है वो कैसे चेंज हो रही है। लेकिन समंदर के अंदर जो पॉल्यूशन है, कितने मछुआरे उसके ऊपर डिपेंड है। समंदर के अंदर से नमक बनता है, उसके ऊपर एक कास्ट जीती है, राइट। कई सारे कम्युनिटीज़ इस तरह के हैं जो एनवायरनमेंट के कुछ कुछ पोर्शन के ऊपर सदियों से जी रहे हैं। तो एनवायरनमेंट से जुड़ा हुआ डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन, ओवर रिसोर्स कंजम्पशन, हमारा स्टैंडर्ड ऑफ लिविंग का हाई डिमांड, और अच्छा जीना है, और अच्छा जीना है, और अच्छा जीना है, ये बहुत डिमांड कर रहा है। और जो लोग बिल्कुल भी कंजम्पशन नहीं कर रहे, बिटर ट्रूथ ये है कि रिटर्न्स उनको देने पड़ रहे हैं बहुत बड़ी मात्रा में। इसलिए कभी कभी मैं डिसएग्री होती हूँ कि क्लाइमेट चेंज ये सबके लिए उसी बड़ी मात्रा में सेम सवाल नहीं है। ये किसी किसी कम्युनिटी के लुप्त होने का सवाल है, किसी भाषाओं के लुप्त होने का सवाल है, और यस फिर किसी को गर्मी लगने का सवाल है, किसी का टेम्परेचर चेंज होने का सवाल है। सभी तकलीफ में है, लेकिन कुछ सबसे पहले डूबेंगे और फिर लोगों तक आते आते हम अवेयर होंगे।
If you think today that you have to leave your job or place a resignation at your workplace, you will plan, you will think about it and then resign. But what of those communities whose occupations, whose professions are being impacted because of climate change? Many times they don't even know why the climate around them is being impacted the way it is, because they are not the ones consuming all the resources that they're actually trying to preserve. Many communities that are rich and are dominant communities around the tribal communities that Deepa speaks of are the ones consuming these resources, but unfortunately, returns are being paid by those who are trying to preserve resources and environment. Therefore, climate change is not an equal conversation and an equal discussion to start with. For some, the climate change conversation is about rising temperatures, about having to turn on ACs and feeling hot. But for some communities, it's a conversation about their very existence.
Thank you for that, Deepa. That was so important for all of us to ground in that crisis and the experience and the unequal impacts of the climate crisis. And we see this at the global level as well, where the global north has produced historically 92% of all greenhouse gas emissions, but the global south is experiencing its worst impacts. Within the global south, you mentioned indigenous people, Dalit people, women, they are experiencing its worst impacts, right? Thank you for that grounding. I want to shift the focus of the conversation a little bit to Rikin and Shruti as well, and hear how they are approaching this crisis from their vantage point, and also how they are thinking about incorporating community voice and agency in their solutions. And then Deepa will come back to you and ask you the same question as well. So let's start with Rikin, then we'll go to Shruti.
Yeah, I'd echo what Deepa has shared, which is we can listen to the statistics around IPCC reports around how India is not going to be able to produce rice in the coming decade, and we're already seeing increasing prices for rice. We can see the effect of other parts of India seeing extreme weather events like floods that are destroying crops en masse. But it's really those individual stories at the community level where when you meet individual farmers in our case, and see that loss of hope. Agriculture itself has always been a major source of livelihood for most of India. But yet, it's become this vocation of last resort that people are trying to migrate out of. And the loss of hope is demonstrated by the types of reflections that especially women farmers will share, which is that the markets have failed them. The soil has failed them. The weather has failed them. The government has failed them. Sometimes their spouses have failed them. And in a lot of cases, they've even given up, sometimes even on God, as being a source of hope for themselves. And I think the pandemic, which really demonstrated the worst possible shocks to this exact same segment of people, is now being compounded even further by climate. And of course, the root cause of the pandemic was what? It was this same climate and human infraction on animal communities that resulted in COVID-19. And so where did those people of these farming communities or tribal communities, especially of women, find connection? Was each other, right? Where there was resilience, to the extent that there was resilience during this super tragic period of time of the pandemic, was where communities came together, where they had these informal social networks with their family members, with their neighbors, that they shared information with each other about things like what were the crops that I grew and how did I grow them. And sometimes we have a thrust towards formalization of supply chains in agriculture or formalization of metrics to try to reduce climate emissions. But sometimes we don't value the power of those informal social networks that people have, that define community and define the power of even India, right, in terms of its vibrant and diverse society. And that's been a similar trajectory for our work, where we're layering digital technology onto these informal social networks, not to thrust some foreign piece of information, but rather to see how we can elevate the voices of the community members themselves and build stronger communities that can be more resilient in the face of the types of shocks which are only going to keep exacerbating for the foreseeable future. And where, even for me personally, I came to this work from a totally different background of computer science and aerospace engineering. But what motivated me to study those things? It was looking at peers who had studied computer science and aerospace engineering before me, and that's what motivated me to do those things. And the same thing is what we have to try to do for this demographic of people: elevate their voices, elevate their stature, so that they themselves can see themselves as role models of inspiration who are able to overcome these seemingly intractable problems of climate change and this lack of hope.
Thank you, Rikin. Shruti, let's hear a little bit how you're approaching this from the policy angle. Yeah, tell us about your work.
Yeah, thank you. Namaskar, good afternoon to everybody. And it's very inspiring to hear the stories of my fellow panelists. I think I want to just reiterate one thing, that climate injustice is at the heart of climate change, right? So people who have done literally nothing to contribute to this problem are going to suffer the worst impacts. And I just want to add one more statistic to it because it's mind-boggling. The top 10% of the world's population contributes to about half of global greenhouse gas emissions, and the bottom 50% contributes less than 10%. And coming, if we come at the country level, so India has historically contributed less than 4% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, but India is actually the country which will suffer the most in terms of climate impacts. And studies have shown that for every ton of carbon emitted anywhere, whether it's in China or the US or India, India will suffer maximum damage for every ton of carbon emitted. And why is that? We understand that, right? Because we have a huge percentage of population dependent on agriculture. We have hundreds of millions of people living downstream from Himalayan glaciers, which are projected to melt in the second half of the century. I have no idea how we are going to handle displacement and migration of that scale. And anyways, I mean, enough of the doomsday talking here, but now I want to switch to a slightly brighter side of the clean energy transition that we truly believe in at the India Energy and Climate Center. There are a lot of co-benefits of this clean energy transition which are actually going to help enhance equity. And let me take a couple of examples. So one is just simply air pollution. So you might have heard, and a lot of us have lived that, India is one of the most polluted countries in the world. We have over 1 million premature deaths every year due to outdoor air pollution. And a huge percentage of that, over a quarter of that, is caused because of coal power generation or due to petrol or gasoline or diesel vehicles on the roads. And the disproportionate burden of this air pollution is not coming to people like us who are roaming around in air-conditioned cars, but people who are driving auto rickshaws and are on two-wheelers and pulling cycle rickshaws. And also people who are living close to coal power plants, right? And dealing with the air pollution and the water pollution close to these, or the coal mines for that matter. So moving to clean electricity generation and moving to zero emission vehicles, or what we call zero emission vehicles, but basically not running on oil, which causes wars and destroys communities, is going to help clean up the air. It's going to help increase equity in terms of right to clean air, just as an example. The other big thing I would say is from a jobs perspective. Now, India is the most populous nation in the world as of this month or last month, I lose track. We have about 600 million people in the age bracket of 18 to 35 years, in that age bracket. And I think just in terms of our poverty alleviation goals as a nation, we want to pull out 225 million people out of poverty. And to do that, job creation is a huge, huge part of that solution. And we truly believe that India has this real opportunity to become a manufacturing hub of clean technology products, because especially with the current geopolitical situation where the world is looking for an alternative to China, and India has made certain strides there. And studies have shown that moving from a fossil-based economy to a clean energy-based economy, there's a net gain in jobs. In fact, India's renewable energy sector, which is doing great wonders and has become a case study for the entire world, it's expected to employ about 4.5 million people by 2030, which is already more than what the coal economy employs today. So anyway, so those are the couple of, we feel there are a lot of great, domestic interests that will be met. Also, in terms of energy independence, India imports 90% of its oil, which causes a lot of, basically the inflation index directly tracks global oil prices for India. And disproportionate burden of inflation comes on vulnerable and poor households. And if you can decouple those two things by using domestically produced clean energy, we believe that India will be a lot better off in terms of macroeconomic stability as well. And let's say, what else? I think from a macro perspective, it will be worth reiterating that at 2 degrees Celsius, all of coral reefs disappear, right? And that is 500 million livelihoods that are dependent on coral reefs. So we really can't, I think we have to do all that we can to not let the world reach there. Unfortunately, it does mean that we have to change the way the top 10% of this world lives, right? And that it means that we have to change the way we produce our energy, which will be needed to develop the global south. We have to change the way we move around. We have to change the way we produce our goods. And 80% of current energy supply is coming from oil, coal, and gas, and we have to tilt that balance heavily towards clean energy. And at the India Energy and Climate Center, what we are doing is we are saying, when we talk about policy frameworks for this clean energy transition, we have to put equity in transition at the core of our work. So it is a horizontal pillar informing all our work. Just again, taking an example, what that means is that tomorrow, when we are incentivized domestic manufacturing of batteries, can we incentivize investment into rural areas or into disadvantaged communities, into fossil-dependent communities, and transition them and make sure that the investment goes there? And when we are talking about adaptation, yes, we are going to try as much as we can to double the energy efficiency of air conditioners so we don't need extra electricity, but we are also going to work on affordable cooling solutions at the district level for rural areas because we are going to see deaths due to heat waves. So that's just a couple of ways we are thinking of incorporating equity into our work.
Thank you for that, Rikin and Shruti. That was so important to learn about small farmers and how technology can be used to advance their goals, and then the important work happening in clean energy policy, right, at the governmental levels. And then just something to add, right, to the clean energy policy is let's nuance it about what equity could mean here, right? And what it would mean to involve community voices in clean energy policies. That what we don't want, what climate movements in the US have called green colonialism, right? We don't want another ExxonMobil running solar power plants or wind energy. That would be the nightmare scenario, right? What we do want is decentralized energy systems that are managed, run, and controlled by local communities. And what the government of India, while commendable in some ways in the transition to solar and wind, some of the work has also been problematic. Because some of these solar missions, there's a public-private partnership in Assam right now, some of these clean energy missions have only become an excuse for land grabbing. And land is being grabbed from Dalit, indigenous communities, from small and peasant farmers, who then lose their trust in the government, who lose their livelihoods without adequate compensation. So this is what it would mean to bring communities to the table when devising clean energy policy, right? And that's how we can have policy that can be equitable and can place communities at the center. Okay, so now that we scared you, with all of these abysmal climate stats, let's turn the focus a little bit to solutions and see and hear from Deepa about what are the solutions, climate solutions that communities are leading in this time.
सोल्यूशन के ऊपर जाने से पहले एक मेरे दिमाग में जो थॉट आ रहा है कि एनवायरमेंटल के साथ जो भी शोषण है वो अगर हम फेमिनिस्ट लेंस से देखें तो औरत के साथ जो भी शोषण हो रहा है वो सेम शोषण एनवायरनमेंट के साथ हो रहा है। औरत जिस बच्चे को जन्म देती है उसके आगे उसका नाम ही नहीं लगता है। उसी तरह एनवायरनमेंट को जिन्होंने पाला पोसा, जिसका संरक्षण किया, उस इंडिजीनियस एंटीडियंटी लोगों का नाम ही उसके आगे नहीं लगता है। ठीक है, मेरे लिए डेमोक्रेसी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है क्योंकि क्लाइमेट चेंज के इसमें भी डेमोक्रेसी बहुत काम करेगी। तो एक सवाल जो है वो मेरे दिमाग में आता है कि क्लाइमेट सॉल्यूशंस किसके नज़रिए से चाहिए और किसके लिए चाहिए, राइट? ये फंडामेंटल सवाल है। क्लाइमेट सॉल्यूशन जिसके नज़रिए से होगा, अगर वो थोड़ा सा पावरफुल होगा तो सॉल्यूशन भी उसी तरह से होगा। लेकिन क्लाइमेट सॉल्यूशन ईमानदारी से अगर ग्रासरूट दलित आदिवासी एंटीडियंटी के लिए चाहिए तो उसका स्वरूप थोड़ा सा अलग होगा, उसकी रचना थोड़ी सी अलग होगी, उसकी प्रायोरिटी थोड़ी सी अलग होगी।
Before talking about solutions, Deepa wants to first just call out the similarity that exists between the environment crisis and the feminist crisis, or the similarity between the two narratives. When a child is born, traditionally the child does not take the name of the woman, the person who really nurtures the kid. Similarly, the communities that today preserve environment the most are not the ones who are enjoying the benefits of the resources that other communities consume. Therefore, when we define solutions, it's also important to think who are these solutions for? And therefore, these solutions need to be looked at and defined from the lens of tribal Adivasi communities. They need to be not defined from the lens of the communities who today consume the resources and to some extent contribute to the climate crisis?
सॉल्यूशन की तरफ मुझे जो दिख रहा है, मैं क्लाइमेट एक्सपर्ट बिल्कुल नहीं हूँ, लेकिन मैं एक्सपीरियंस के साथ जो महसूस कर रही हूँ वो बात मैं यहाँ पे रख सकती हूँ। क्लाइमेट चेंज ट्रूली पॉलिटिकल मुद्दा है। पॉलिटिक्स के अलावा ये मुद्दा अधूरा है। तो बहुत ज़्यादा हर तबके में जो लोग हैं उनकी ताकत बढ़ानी पड़ेगी कि हम क्रिटिसाइज़ करने के लिए कितने तैयार हैं। क्योंकि मैं यहाँ पे भी सुन रही हूँ, इंडिया में भी सुनती हूँ कि कुछ कुछ चीज़ें तो अच्छी हो रही है। किसके नज़रिए से अच्छी हो रही है, किसके लिए अच्छी हो रही है, वो बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पॉर्टेंट है। डेमोक्रेसी एक्सेस करने वाले ग्राउंड के लोग क्या महसूस कर रहे हैं, उनके पास आते हुए जो भी अड़चनें हैं वो किस अड़चनों में है, उनकी नज़रिए से सुनना बहुत ज़रूरी है। सॉल्यूशन की अगर बात करें तो यस, सॉल्यूशन कुछ सामने है, मे बी 100% नहीं होंगे, लेकिन हर गांव में, हर देहात में, अर्बन में, स्लम में अगर आप जाके देखोगे, शायद उनको नरेटिव क्लाइमेट चेंज के नहीं आएंगे कहने के लिए, लेकिन वो क्लाइमेट चेंज के लिए ही काम कर रहे हैं। जब कोई बारिश के पानी के खिलाफ काम कर रहा है और वो एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन को बोल रहा है कि भाई हमारे घरों में बारिश का पानी आ रहा है, वो क्लाइमेट चेंज का काम है। शायद वो उस सर्कल में नहीं है, इसलिए वो बात नहीं कर पा रहे, वो डेटा, वो स्टैटिस्टिक्स वो दे नहीं पा रहे। तो कम्युनिटी लेड मूवमेंट है, रिसर्च कम्युनिटी लेड है। मैं जानबूझ के कम्युनिटी ऐड कर रही हूँ क्योंकि रिसर्च की भी अपनी एक एलिड भाषा है, राइट। कम्युनिटी लेड रिसर्च है, लीगल सपोर्ट करने वाले लोग हैं, एडवोकेसी करने के लिए रेगुलर पॉलिटिकल डिसीजन मेकर और एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन के पास जाने वाले लोग हैं। अगर आप रिबिल्ड के ही कोहॉर्ट में देखें तो जैसे देवल ने सुबह का, मैं बिल्कुल एग्री करती हूँ। मैं उन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के साथ में थी, मैं और भी सर्कल में हूँ जहाँ पे कम्युनिटी बेस्ड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ट्रूली क्लाइमेट चेंज के बारे में सोचकर एनवायरमेंटल जस्टिस के लिए काम कर रहे हैं। तरीके अलग है, इन डेप्थ है, जहाँ पे कोई ऑक्यूपेशन को लेकर काम कर रहा है, कोई माइग्रेशन को लेकर काम कर रहा है, कोई डिजास्टर को लेकर काम कर रहा है, कोई फ्लड अफेक्टेड एरिया में काम कर रहा है, कोई मेंटल हेल्थ को लेकर काम कर रहा है। ये सारा क्लाइमेट से कनेक्टेड है। और मुझे लगता है कि क्लाइमेट चेंज को लेकर अगर इंक्लूसिव काम करना है तो फिर हम इन सारे मुद्दों को ध्यान में ले सकते हैं।
Change is a deeply political subject. Therefore, one way to fight climate change or to hand power back to the ones impacted the most is to improve the political agency of communities. Action is already happening, be it in India or be it in the US. But the question we need to ask is, whom does this action benefit? It's important to listen to the problems of the marginalized and their solutions. There might already be action that's happening on the grounds. The issue is that a narrative or a lexicon might not exist. There are many community-based organizations that are already working with climate, and as we heard earlier this morning, they might be working on different aspects of climate change. Some might be working on livelihoods, some on mental health. If we want to have an inclusive dialogue or inclusive solutions towards climate change, it's important to view all aspects that community-based organizations today work on to address the challenge.
एक यहाँ पे ऐड करने की कोशिश मैं कर रही हूँ कि हम सब बैठ के यहाँ क्लाइमेट चेंज के बारे में बात तो कर रहे हैं, लेकिन ये भी सच्चाई है कि पावरफुल हैंड जो है वो अभी भी रिसोर्सेस के पीछे बहुत तेज़ी से भाग रहे हैं, उनका स्पीड कम नहीं है। और जो भी एनवायरमेंटल जस्टिस के लिए आवाज़ देगा वो थ्रेटन और रिस्क में जा सकता है। लेकिन उसके आगे जाकर मैं फिर और बोलूँगी कि कम्युनिटी बेस्ड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन और ज़्यादा थ्रेटन और रिस्क में है। इंडिविजुअल लीडर खुद थ्रेटन में है, उनके ऑर्गेनाइजेशन रिस्क में है, और फिर वो जो मुद्दे उठाते हैं वो डायरेक्टली पब्लिकली और लोगों के सामने आते हैं। तो मुझे लगता है कि देर आए दुरुस्त आए, ये वक्त सही है कि हमें CBOs के साथ, ग्रासरूट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के साथ, और वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट जो राइट बेस्ड अप्रोच के साथ काम कर रहे हैं, अधिकारों की परिभाषा जानते हैं, अधिकारों के दायरे में बात कर रहे हैं। नहीं तो अभी मुंबई में सब जगह पे पेड़ लगाए जा रहे हैं, कौन से पेड़ कहाँ लगाना है, बायोडाइवर्सिटी कुछ पता नहीं है। तो वैसे भी एक्शंस है, उसका क्या करेंगे? तो इसीलिए इंक्लूसिव, इंटरसेक्शनलिटी और डाइवर्सिटी के डिग्निटी के साथ अगर काम करना है तो हमें क्लाइमेट चेंज को लेकर जो एनवायरमेंटल जस्टिस के लिए आवाज़ उठाने वाले लोग हैं उनका रिस्क और उनका थ्रेटन थोड़ा सा बोझा उसका उठाना पड़ेगा, शायद उनके साथ खड़ा होना पड़ेगा। और मुझे लगता है कि ये काफ़ी ब्रिलियंट समय है जहाँ पे हम वो कोशिश कर सकते हैं। हर किसी को सामने आने की भी ज़रूरत नहीं है, लेकिन आपका बोल देना कि आप किसी के साथ रिसोर्सेस से हो, सपोर्ट से हो, आप उनके थॉट के साथ कंट्रीब्यूट कर रहे हो, तो ये भी एक तरह का मॉरल बूस्ट करने वाला और इंटेलेक्चुअल प्रोसेस में कंट्रीब्यूट करने वाली जर्नी है।
While we all sit here and talk about climate change, it's important to realize that the resource rich are still chasing resources. Those who question will continue to be threatened. A lot of the CBOs that are doing work in climate change continue to be threatened even today, and therefore it's important to support their work, support the work of organizations that work with a right-based approach. If in order to build inclusive and intersectional solutions, it's important to respect the knowledge of indigenous communities. Otherwise, the actions that currently are taking place, for example, in Mumbai, where trees are being planted across the city without having information and knowledge about what tree should be planted where and how it impacts the environment, will continue to take place. Therefore, while recognizing that we might not all be able to work with indigenous communities, it's important to support the CBOs that are actually doing work with them. And in that way, we can support some of the community-led climate solutions that these organizations try to foster.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepa, for inviting us into this holistic and interconnected solution nature of the climate crisis and how communities are addressing this crisis in this way, about tackling immediate needs, long-term needs. Here in the global north, we have an academic debate about adaptation versus mitigation, but for lived communities in the global south, this is an existential struggle, and they have to do all of it, right? Not adaptation versus mitigation, but all of it. So thank you for sharing that. I know we have a few minutes remaining. I hope from the Dasra team we can get a few more minutes. I would love to turn it over to all of you and invite some questions for our panelists. So.
Thanks so much for the great panel. So I wanted to pick on what Shruti were also talking about in terms of livelihoods and the intersection of livelihoods and climate. And so one option that you mentioned is if we have more manufacturing and production of clean energy in-house, then maybe that can provide more employment opportunities. Can you think about maybe other ways of employing people in India today, especially the youth, in some sort of climate change related or supportive efforts?
See, from my perspective, I think India has done a great job in terms of, the services industry, for example. Of course, still 60% of our population is employed in agriculture. I personally feel that, with the kind of youth, numbers that we have, the only sustainable way of creating jobs is large-scale manufacturing. That's just my understanding of how it's going to evolve. And I think the Indian government realizes that, and there is a lot of now incentives for setting up manufacturing. For example, there is a production-linked incentive scheme which has put out about $6 billion of incentives to set up battery manufacturing, EV manufacturing, solar module manufacturing. In terms of resilience, of course, there's a lot of community-based organizations like Deepa's and many more who are trying to work with grassroots communities to build their resilience. But I think, not to dissect, keep those two terms separate, but I think mitigation and resilience have to work hand in hand. We only have this decade. Let's remember, if we don't act in the next 10 to 20 years, no amount of resilience building and no amount of adaptation can save us, basically. So it is that dire a juncture. But having said that, we are also at the best possible point in time where clean energy is so much cheaper than it was 5 years ago that we actually have some solutions in sight to actually control the carbon emissions. But unless we do that, nothing is going to help.
I have a probably follow-up question, may just affect Shruti as well. I think, there's always this question of policy and whether what, you give policy, yeah, hoga, banayenge, it'll happen, right? It's hard to see that change will happen or that it'll go to the right places. And, maybe if you can, other examples where you've seen this happen, right? Where policy has moved things in the direction where there is benefit, and it's a yes and option.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it also will connect to what Rajiv mentioned in one of his remarks. So actually, let me just share a personal story. Back in 2012, I was working at the Observer Research Foundation, and I was looking at solar mini-grids as an option for electricity access and development in rural areas. At that time, India had 200 to 300 million people who lacked electricity access. And nobody was thinking that it's even possible to electrify India in our lifetime, right? So we were thinking, oh, everywhere we are going to put up solar mini-grids. I have friends who have been putting up solar mini-grids in tribal villages for the last decade. And in 2015, the central government of India said, nothing doing. We are going to electrify each and every village, each and every household. And over the next 8 years, they have done it. They have electrified 98% of India. And I think that's a tremendous achievement. And that just came from sheer policy will. Now, of course, the detractors will still say that, oh, the supply, quality is not there. I agree with that. But step one is to electrify. Step two is to improve the quality of supply, and that will happen. When I was in New Delhi working at the Central Power Sector Regulator, and people at control centers of the power distribution system don't go home when there are heat waves. You have to keep lights on, So people are working hard to make it happen. It is not very visible from outside. So I think just as an example, so just to go back to Rajiv's point, yes, I think distributed energy systems are a great way to build resilience. But if we are talking about climate scale, for the kind of scale and pace of deployment that we need, policy and technology is essential. With the 40 gigawatt target that India had for decentralized systems, we were only able to achieve 5 gigawatts because the transaction cost is too high, but we were able to put 60 gigawatts of large-scale solar. We just don't have time in climate. I'm sorry. It's just we need the scale.
I was just going to add one thing, which is, obviously there is a rural to urban shift that's overall happening. But I think sometimes it's a bit sometimes overstated in the sense that I was just, visiting some of the villages that we started our work with just outside of Bangalore, 30 minutes outside of Bangalore, and Kanakpura, if anyone knows. We started working there in 2006. And when we started to work there in 2006, already they were starting to think about building the ring roads around Bangalore for whatnot. And there was a real feeling that these farmers were going to be no more in the not so distant future. Guess what? Even just in March, they're still there. What's happened is that the next generation is still farming, but they've upgraded. And they're starting to tap in to some of these government policies that do exist to support some of these farmers' transition to some of these more climate smart practices. Things like investing in a polyhouse nursery so that they can sell saplings as a business to their fellow farmers and at the same time support climate goals of doing agroforestry and the like. And I think that we're starting to see that this next generation is actually starting to move forward into the leveling up of agriculture. Instead of the subsistence form of agriculture, when 17 years ago when we were just starting up Digital Green, most of these farmers were just to be able to meet their own food sufficiency goals, and in a lot of cases not even meeting those food sufficiency goals. Now they're starting to become these front lines of the climate change movement because in a lot of ways, unlike the green revolution era of the 70s and 80s, where it was just a tech transfer of hybrid varieties of seed and fertilizer as being the things that were going to boost farmer productivity, the reality of this new climate change era that is obviously going to be with us for the foreseeable future is that it is super dynamic and super variable. And certainly research has a huge important value to play, but it is the farmers who are actually the most prevalent researchers, because they're the ones having to deal with these climate change changes firsthand, and they're experimenting often through just trial and error to see what makes sense and what doesn't make sense from a super practical point of view. And to Rajiv's point, I think the danger is that there's a potential power grab that could take place as this climate change movement takes place, which could be land grabs or grabs of people's data in a super centralized way. And we've seen that story play out. Where? Right here in California, right? And that's resulted in what? Topsoil degradation and water depletion, and the consolidation to only 4 big ag companies, right, in the US. That is not the future that we should hope for India and India's farmers. We should leverage distribution and decentralization, which is really the great power and resilience that India has, and we should leverage digital technologies that now allow for people to take control over their own data and their own choices in a way that doesn't have to just follow the normal process of consolidation. Because the reality is, that's not gonna happen. There's 120 million farmers in India. Don't expect there to be less, because what's happening generation after generation is what? Further and further land fragmentation. And it is also the case that many of these people are still remaining in there. And they are our new sort of champions of thinking about how to overcome these climate change challenges that we have ahead of us.
Thank you, Rikin and Shruti. I want to ask Deepa to jump in here and talk about the impact of policy on communities.
शॉर्ट में मैं ट्रूली कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन के ऊपर विश्वास करती हूँ. तो अभी वैसे कि कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ह्यूमन राइट पर्सपेक्टिव से जो भी चीज़ें सामने आएगी वो हमारे लिए काम की ही होगी. लेकिन 2-3 डाउट मेरे दिमाग में होते हैं कि बनाने वाले लोग कौन हैं. पॉलिसी हो, प्रोविजंस हो, ये सारे स्ट्रक्चर और ड्राफ्ट करने वाले लोग कौन हैं. यहाँ पे ग्राउंड रिप्रेजेंटेशन अगर नहीं रहेगा तो उनको जिस चश्मे से उनके प्रॉब्लम दिख रहे हैं वो वहाँ पे नहीं आ पाएंगे. दूसरा, क्लाइमेट चेंज अगर हम बस पोल्यूशन, एनर्जी यहाँ तक की बात करें तो मेरे ख्याल से वो लिमिटेड हो सकता है. क्लाइमेट चेंज के अंदर जीआईडी लेंस क्या है, क्लाइमेट चेंज का अभी तक हुआ इम्पैक्ट उन कम्युनिटी के बारे में हम क्या सोच रहे हैं, क्या पॉलिसी उसके बारे में बात करेगी, क्या पॉलिसी के बारे में मतलब पॉलिसी उसके बारे में वोकल होगी. और आने वाले दिनों में ये इम्पैक्ट ऑब्वियस है, जो पहले जिनके ऊपर इम्पैक्ट हुआ है उनके अंदर कोई भी बीमारी का कारण न होते हुए हम उन्हें फिजिकली, सोशली हर अंग से बीमार कर रहे हैं. तो फिर क्लाइमेट चेंज की जो पॉलिसीज़ होंगी वो एग्जिस्टिंग इस कम्युनिटीज़ के ऊपर जीआईडी लेंस के साथ, डाइवर्सिटी, इंटरसेक्शनलिटी, इंक्लूसिविटी के साथ इनके ऊपर जो उसका इम्पैक्ट हुआ है उसके बारे में क्या बात करेगी. दूसरा कि पॉलिसी कई बार अच्छे थॉट से बनती है, वहाँ पे कई सारा जो है वो सोच विचार होते हैं, लेकिन वो जब एग्जीक्यूट होने जाती है तब वहाँ पे जो ये एक बीच का ब्रिज है वो कई बार फिर से आदिवासी, दलित और एंटी को क्रिमिनलाइज करना, उनके ही रिसोर्सेज से उनको परहेज करना या क्लाइमेट चेंज के मैटर्स में उनको लेबर बनाना, ये सारे मैटर्स इर्द गिर्द दिखते हैं. तो वो एक्चुअली ईमानदारी से इंक्लूसिव कैसी होगी, वो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल और ह्यूमन राइट के पर्सपेक्टिव में कैसी होगी, शायद मुझे लगता है कि मेरे नज़रिए से, कम्युनिटी लेंस से, वो सबसे बड़ा चैलेंज है.
Deepa truly believes in the power of the Constitution, the Indian Constitution. Therefore, anything that sort of comes out of it or from human rights charters, she has full faith in it. But the important question to ask here is, who are the people who are drafting policies? Who are the people who are writing laws? And therefore, ground representation at that stage is extremely important. Right now, when we talk about climate change, we often talk about pollution and energy. but that might be a slightly limited lens of looking at it. What about the impact that climate change has on communities? And therefore, the question to ask is, does policy consider this impact? If it doesn't yet, it should. Policy formation versus its implementation is also an important consideration to keep in mind. Often, policy is drafted and is written when people are thinking of it from a good place, but the implementation is incorrectly done or is compromised. Community members or members of marginalized tribal communities end up becoming laborers of climate solutions that are crafted by dominant communities.
Thank you, Deepa. I know there's another question at the back, but do we have time? Okay. So I'm sorry. Maybe we can chat during the reception. And I just want to thank Deepa and Rikin and Shruti and remind everyone that yes, this is an absolutely critical decade for us to get it right. What we do in these coming years will have an impact on how we live for the next several decades. And so there's a lot at stake. And that's why it's important to include communities at the front lines into any climate conversations that we have, because one can argue the reason we are in this mess in the first place is because we have marginalized communities. Indigenous communities have been stewarding land resources for millennia before the advent of climate change. Once land was taken away from communities, we suddenly had the climate crisis. What's that about, right? So it's a greater risk not including communities. We get the scale and speed question, but what are we compromising by not including communities, and in what ways is that a solution? So there's a great opportunity in this moment to get it right, to move more and better resources towards communities in a way that's aligned with their visions and practice, and to learn about community frameworks and keep uplifting them, and then influence your peer funders to do the same. So I'll leave you on that note. Thank you, and thank you to the Dasra team.